Okay, so we are going to go ahead and record this just in case we want to look back at any point in time and go over this kind of concept, which is objects in JavaScript. Now, where we're kind of starting from in the code that I have up on the screen right now, we're storing our data in arrays, and if you kind of look at this problem, we have our data set here, which is just a list of usernames in an array and user scores, and we have this ability to add add a new element to the array. So now we can display individual scores and kind of get the individual data out. And we've got some statistics and this third button click. And so we just kind of have information popping up on the screen. But the point is we've got a little bit of functionality kind of wrapped into a lab that we did prior. And so I wanted to kind of start here by showing, hey, one way in JavaScript of storing data is in arrays, and arrays are super common. So we have to know how to work with arrays. And oftentimes, objects will be used in conjunction with arrays. So a lot of times they're actually used together. So before we learned objects, we got to learn arrays. But now we're kind of having this concept of an object. And what is an object, right? Well, first off, the word object is obviously a very generic word. Because an object is meant to be a computer, a digital version of a thing, right? An object, one of the first ways I learned what an object could be is literally any noun in the English language, right? A noun is a person, place, thing. I think the technical definition is or an event. Does that sound right? Person, place, thing, or an event? I think if you took the English class, right, that's what they're going to tell you, right? But literally anything can be an object. So I think of, the real world that's around us, and you look around the real world, and literally anything could be an object. Right? So an object is a kind of a digital version of a real world thing. So I look around me and I see windows. So you could have a window object. In fact, not to confuse you, but JavaScript does have a window object, right? It's already built in. But I see a mouse. I could have a computer mouse object. I've got shoes on. You could have a shoe object. You could have a person object. You could have a city, right? A place, right? A city object. Any person, place, or thing can be an object. So, the best way I know to answer that question is literally any noun in the real world can be an object. And storing data about that object, about that thing in JavaScript would be done by storing it in a JavaScript object. Okay, so what's really kind of, I like this problem that we have here because we have kind of these different, we have the beginnings of an object. And what do I mean by the beginnings of an object? Well, really Evan is that number 90 is Evan's score, right? We kind of said, well, we're relating this data through its subscript or through its position, but that's just what we did programmatically. Like we solved that problem that way. But other than kind of our like programmatic solution, there's really no linking together of Evan and 90. Like they're actually separate places in RAM, and they're not really actually linked together any other way. Well, if you think, okay, well, what is that object? Well, that could be a student, right? And a student has a first name. Well, then you might have, if you actually were to continue with this array solution, this might be user first names. You might have user last names. You might have like the classes that they're enrolled in. You might have, their student ID. All of a sudden, if you think about a student, it wouldn't be hard to have 10 arrays, 15 arrays, 20 arrays, 50 arrays. Like, there's a lot of information that you might store about a student, and all of a sudden you've got to have all these separate arrays to store this student information. And that's really, that's where storing this information in an array kind of falls apart. So when you have a more complex thing, you store things in objects. And when you have a bunch of the same things, then you store those same things in an array. If you have a bunch of things, well, then you store, basically what I'm getting to is, in very commonly what you're going to see is you're going to see an array of objects. Right? So when it comes to, like, what's the difference between an array and an object, right? We already said when you have a thing, you store it in an object. When you have to store when you have to store several of the same thing, and that thing could be simple or complex. Like, if it is a simple thing, then it doesn't need to be an object. Like, if you just have a bunch of first names, those first names don't have to be an object. That's a simple piece of data, right? But if it's a complex piece of data, a piece of data with a bunch of properties, then it's an object, right? So when you have to store several of the same thing, that's when you use an array. Okay? So if it's a simple thing, it could just be a variable. If it's a complex thing with multiple properties, multiple pieces of data, you might store it in an object. Okay? Now, the thing to remember today, if there's one takeaway that I want you to remember, in JavaScript, brackets signal array, curlies signal object. Right? So that's just a good thing to remember from today. Forget the rest of it. If you can remember that, that's a good starting point. Brackets, when you see the brackets, you know you're working with an array. When you see curlies, you know object. And then hopefully you kind of understand a little bit of the theory as to what goes in where. You know, if it's a complex, real world thing, you're talking an object. So what I wanted to do briefly is kind of refactor this so that we're not using these arrays as we have here, which is basically going to make me delete everything. I'm just going to basically start over. I'm going to have 3 click events. Okay, and we're going to redo this using objects. And so I want to start with just one object, and that'll represent a student. And so you can kind of get the syntax. Okay, now individual student, you're going to notice I said objects are in curly, so I'm going to have a curly over here. And JavaScript objects are always in what are called key value pairs. And so what we're going to put on the left here is the key, is known as the key. You call it the key, a better name, I think, is just the property, right? So what is the student property? Well, first name, colon. So on the left, we have the property. It's also referred to as the key. And on the right, you have the value. So we've created our first student object. It has one property, the first name property, Evan. And then I'm going to put test score, individual test score is 90. Okay. So let's do this. And we have our first object. Or my linter is not happy because I've created this object, but I haven't used the object yet. All right, so I need to actually use this object. So what can I say about this? A couple of things. If you come from an object-oriented background, right? JavaScript objects do not need what is called a class. Like, I didn't create a blueprint for my student, right? I was able to just kind of off the cuff create this object. Okay? In other languages, you have to have this blueprint before you create objects. And in C#, of course, we're gonna study C# next semester. You have to have these blueprints before you can create objects. You have to have these templates. We don't have a template here. Now, you can create what are known as classes in JavaScript, but it's not a requirement, right? Just remember, in general, JavaScript is considered a loosely typed language. It's a little bit more flexible than these object-oriented languages. Okay, so I did not have to create a class, this blueprint. However, you could, but JavaScript is pretty flexible, and I just wanted to keep this as simple as possible. So this is how I wanted to first demonstrate my first object. Now, notice I basically have my three event listeners, and I don't really have any other students yet. I just have my one student, and I'm not displaying individual scores, but I can. So here's my middle event handler, which is a submit button. So if I want to output this, right? I think I have a paragraph somewhere. What did I call it? So here's here's what I did. I put it in a list. So I've got this list, and what I did was I constructed a new LI, and then I appended that LI to the list. So I'll do this now like I did before, just with this different object instead of an array. So I think I did something like constant LI document create element. Go ahead and create the LI. And then I did li dot inner text. The point is, I'm trying to pull an individual record of information out. Maybe I would even add last name. Notice the commas at the end here. This last comma on line 21 is optional. However, I add it because it's optional, and if you ever add another property, you already got the comma there. So I've got a first name, last name, and test score. So let's pull this information out. And so we'll say student dot first name. Okay. Now, notice this is how we're putting data in with this syntax. There are actually a couple of syntaxes for reading the properties. The easiest syntax is just with this dot notation. So our variable is called student. The property is first name. When I say student dot first name, it should read the value of Evan, right? The key is first name. The value is Evan. Key value pair, key value pair, key value pair. So this will say first name, last name. Whoops. First name, student dot last name. Score is, this will be student dot score. Test score. Okay. So this is just an individual student putting the data into the object, pulling the data out of the object. Of course, we need to append the LI. So let's document get element by ID, list user scores, dot append the LI. Okay, and okay. That's the starting point. That's the starting point for objects. Understanding how they're constructed and how to put data in and how to pull data out. Okay? What is an object? It's a digital representation of a real world thing. How do you represent a real world thing in JavaScript? The answer is with objects. Also worth noting, a very, very, very important thing here is that in the real world, our software is going to interact with databases. Our websites are going to exchange information back and forth. And if you go through a little history lesson, for a long time, there was this technology called XML. And XML was a way of sending data across the internet. And it would look something like this. First off, people liked XML because it looked a lot like HTML, if you see my comment, right? You could define what were called schemas, which were the rules that the XML had to follow. And then you would write these tags that were nested inside of one another with opening and closing tags. And you would send data from point A to point B across the internet using XML. And XML was really popular until, I don't know, 15 years ago. Just guessing, spitballing here. Okay. And 15 years ago, XML kind of got an upgrade. And they started using JavaScript objects to send data around on the internet. A term that you're going to hear a lot is this JSON. All JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation. Okay, this is a JSON object. This is a JavaScript object. Okay, so another reason why it's really important to get comfortable with objects is because when we start working in the real world, we're going to be sending data back and forth between different places, and most of the time in 2022, that data is being sent back and forth in JavaScript object notation, in JavaScript objects. So odds are, if you're creating a website that has like a Facebook login, right? Log in with Facebook, log in with your Google credentials. If you're interacting with any other public software, you're probably going to be receiving data from them in JavaScript objects, right? So, what is an object? How to work with an object, and of course, in 2022, it's just very fundamental to work with objects, because if you're interacting with other web softwares, they're going to be giving you the data in this JavaScript format. Okay? So that's a really important piece. Now, this is the easiest way to extract the first name, and to be quite honest, this is what you'll typically do, is this dot notation. There is another syntax here that looks something like this, and we're going to put this in quotes, and notice this still works. So student dot first name or student sub first name. So this syntax is less common, but it is another syntax. And this syntax does provide one benefit. And we're not going to dive too deep into that benefit. But the one benefit of using this syntax over the dot notation, so maybe you would call this the array notation instead of the dot notation, is, and realize if you're hard coding this, we're always coding the first name. There's no benefit if you're hard coding the property. But if you don't know the property that you're going to be setting or getting, like if it's a dynamic, like if you're letting the user change a piece of information about an object, you might let the user select, what are you changing? The first name, the last name, the score, right? So you're picking a drop-down list, and so you're changing a single piece of information that's dynamic in nature, right? And then you could provide that variable inside of here, inside of your string value. And this syntax is considered more dynamic for that reason. You could actually let the user, the end user, supply the property that they want to update. Point is, most of the time, you're just going to be just doing this. Okay? There is a benefit to the array notation, but, you know, it's muted. You don't see it a ton, but it is a thing. All right. So what are you guys' thoughts? What do you think? Is this so far so good? Any questions on JavaScript objects? Have you not already seen some of this in Free Code Camp? Yeah. A little bit. Does it ring a bell? Good. We are definitely going to be working with objects in this class. Well, kind of quickly, you kind of see, you know, you could do this kind of const student 1 is this one, and then you could say, okay, we've got another student, student 2 is Bill, Brad. I don't know why this guy's name's coming to mind. This is a tech fella, is a guy in tech, and so whatever. And so you could do this, right? You could have a bunch of different students and just give them different numbers, student 1, 2, 3. But what did I say just a little bit earlier? When you have a bunch of the same thing, put them in an array. So if you have a thing, the thing is an object. But if you have a bunch of the same thing, you put them in an array. So instead of creating a bunch of individual students, we'll make a students array. And notice what I'm going to do here. I'm going to surround my objects in brackets. Right? My objects are the curlies, the brackets are the array. So now I have an array. That array has one element. That element is an object. And the array is called students. Now, of course, refactoring this makes this break, right? I no longer can access my data the same way. Now I have an array. So it's a students array, and I access the subscript. Students sub 0 dot first name. Students sub 0 dot last name. Students sub 0 dot test score. All right. So now that we're getting into this, okay, we're going to have an array of objects. We need to access the individual objects through the subscript of the array, and then we can access the properties. Okay, and now we get access to our data again. Okay, but you can kind of probably take a guess where this is going. Let's go ahead and add our students' data back in, and let's push a new object onto the array, and let's display their average scores, right? Let's kind of flush the rest of this example out, right? So here's our students. Here's our first student, and I'm just gonna not use my name anymore because what the heck. I'm going to add, this is my favorite podcast, so we're going to use the names of the All-In podcast. Chamath Palihapitiya. Oh, goodness. Let's spell his name right. And we've got David Sachs. This podcast, they said this last night, they're the 14th largest podcast now in America, so good for them. And last one is David Freeberg. Okay, so let's give them some different scores. Oh, wait a minute. Well, really, Brad Gerstner is not typically on the show. It is... it's the host. Come on. His name's on the tip of my tongue. This is really not the important part. Jason Calacanis. These are all Silicon Valley guys. Successful techie entrepreneurs. Okay, so let's give them all different scores. Okay. Now we have an array of objects. By the way, objects are super common. Arrays of objects are common. It's also, let's think about this, it's also more likely that our students don't just have one test score. Wouldn't it be more likely that each individual student has an array of scores? You get where I'm going? So properties can also be arrays. We could do this where each object has an array of scores. Now, we'll get there, but we're not there. I don't want to start there, if that makes sense. For now, we'll just say an array of objects with a single value test score. Okay, so objects can have properties with arrays. Their properties could also be nested objects. So you could have objects inside of objects. Okay? That's very common because one of the database systems is called a document database system. It's called Mongo. And it's very common in Mongo to have objects inside of objects, nested objects, or nested documents, as they would say. Okay, so let's kind of create our loop. So here's our logic to add an individual LI. And let's use a traditional for loop. Keep in mind, if you want to loop through the properties of an object, we could use for in. Might be worth exploring. Let's just bring in our traditional for loop. And we'll say, wait a minute. Yeah, I guess let's print them out, and then we'll add a new score next. So we'll say, okay, so what do we need to do here? We need to loop through, students is an array, so we need to loop through students.length. So let's loop through students.length. For each student, we'll do this logic right here. Now we're not printing out student sub 0 anymore. This is now student sub index. Okay, so now we have an array of objects, and now we're looping through that array and printing out each individual thing in an LI. And let's take a look. And now we've got the data back out. Cool? We doing all right? Questions so far? So the next feature that we've got the individual scores. Again, I'll probably clear it at the top. I'll clear my list every time you click this button so it doesn't append. Just kind of set it to an empty string. Because before it would append. The next step would be to add a new object to the array. So let's say this. Now notice I've got first name, last name. Let's just well. I don't have, so I guess the first thing is I could just accept the first and last name and split. So with this JavaScript split, right? So there's a split method that can basically split a string at a space. So I'm going to use this split so that I can extract the first name and the last name, assuming there's a space in between that, and that's a perfect answer, which it isn't. We'll do this. Const first name equals document get element by ID text first name dot value dot split. Wait a sec. Okay. I'll say full name. There's probably ways to do this on one line. So the full name is going to be the whole value, and then what I'll do, const first name is full name dot split and then I need the it puts it into an array, so I need to say sub-0 is what I need. I don't think that's the right syntax, but let me check it. I need the sub-0 off the split. So let's just alert first name. I'm pretty sure that's going to break, but I just want to see if that's... So we say Bob. Oh, it did get Bob. Okay, so let's... I expected that to break, so let's just double check that sub1 is going to be the last name. Okay, all right, so here's what I'll do. I can condense this into first name is get the value dot split at the space and give me index 0. And I'll say const last name is that same thing, just give me the second element. Okay, so that's how you know, one text box gets the first and last name. Not a perfect solution, but it works for now. And we'll say const test score equals, and we're going to parse int get element by ID text test score, I believe, dot value. Okay, so let's read the variables. And now let's create our object, and then we're just going to push the object. So const new student equals curlies first name property colon first name variable last name property comma last name variable comma test score. I'm going to show you a shortcut here. Test score comma test score. Okay, so this is creating the first name property, assigning it equal to the first name variable. Last name property, last name variable, so on and so forth. So that creates the object. And now we need to add the object to the array. What's our array? Students. How do we add a new student object to the array? Well, it's the same method we did before, students.push. New student. And let's, I'm not doing any error handling here, so I'm just gonna give the output of new student added. We could add in the error handling, but for now, let's just give them a little happy message saying new user added. Enter text. Now let's just take a look what happens if I spit out, I'm going to spit out the object, new student added. I just want to show you what happens when we create an object and we just spit out the object like in the HTML without using the properties. Mark, I don't know. You can see that doesn't work so well. So I created a JavaScript object and I tried to just spit the entire object out in the HTML. It didn't really work. Here's something that's kind of cool that there is you guys are familiar with console log. There's also one called console.table. And I want to show you new student inside of a console.table. This is a different method on the console that works with objects and kind of formats them nice and pretty. So if I do create Mark Kern here, and I give him a test score of 90, and I look at the console, that's a nice method to be familiar with. It spits all of our data out in a table in the console, so that's cool. And you can see it kind of gives it to us in two different formats, which is fine. But point is, let's go back to this and just say new student dot. I'll just say new student added. New student added. Exclamation point. We don't really need a console table. We just need a push. Maybe one more thing. Like what happens if you just print the students array out? Just to show you. Now arrays are a little bit more friendly than printing out an individual object. Now this is an array of objects. But let's just see what happens. Yeah. So it's an array of objects, so it's still, if this was an array of primitive values, it would actually show you some data there. But it's not, it's an array of objects, so it's still really not that friendly. New student added. Okay, so now let's add in Brad Gerstner got 1,000. New student added. Display individual scores. Cool. Cool. And so we do have the add new student working, display the scores working. We don't have the, I think it wants the highest and the average. And so that's our third button click. And so we'll kind of finish this up. I think a lot of the heavy lifting has been done already, creating the array of objects, adding a new object onto the array with a push, and then printing out each individual piece here. High score, and we did this a little bit earlier, so we're going to create a variable for the high score, and we set number dot min value, so it's an extremely low bar to get over. High score user is empty at first. Let's go ahead and loop through our scores. Now, each student has an individual test score. Bless you. So let's loop through our students. And we'll say if students subindex dot test score is greater than the high score, then let's assign the high score equal to students subindex dot test score. Same logic as before, just working with the data a little bit differently. Getting to the data, I would say. Then we're also going to set the high score user equal to, let's go ahead and put it like their full name, students subindex. So here's what we'll do. We'll do a template literal with their first name and their last name separated by a space. So high score user is their first and last name together. So now let's then also create a variable for the sum. Start that off at 0. Sum scores plus equals dot test score. Again, this would get a little bit more complex if this was an array of individual scores, which we could definitely do that, but for now, keep it simple. Sum of the scores is adding each one individually. We got the high score user, we got the sum. Let's set the average. So we'll say const average score sum scores divided by, right now every student has one score, so we'll divide by the length of students. And then let's get our output. The output, I think, is just in a paragraph called stats. Let's say the high, let's see. We'll say Billy or whatever. Billy, username, high score user, had the highest score of high score. period, space. The average test score was average score. Okay, I think it's prettier that I use to format. I don't really love the way it formats that, but I can get over it. Let's pull this up. Let's add in our Brad Gerstner. Because we don't have data validation, we're allowed to add Brad Gerstner with a score of 1,000. We display individual scores, and let's see what broke. Average score is not defined, so I didn't call it average score, did I? We have a scope problem, right? So what do we have here? We have a variable declared inside of a block. That's a for block. We're declaring this variable here, so it's not accessible outside of that for block. So the solution here is declare it. We'll declare it with let. And then we can assign it average score inside of the block, and now it's accessible outside. So let's refresh. Brad Gerstner has the 1,000, add to the array, display, and Brad Gerstner has the score of Sky 1,000. Of course, his score brings the average up to all of them. Okay. So I'll stop that demo there. That should give you a pretty good idea of how to work with objects inside of JavaScript. Of course, there's always more to learn, but that's kind of a good introduction.